Welcome back to our next conversation. Now, the Central Bank of Nigeria said that it will commence implementation of uniform standards on transfer pricing arrangements in the Nigerian banking industry from June 2021. About 1 month after, what impact does the uniform standard have? Gbolahan Ologunro, Senior Research Analyst with Quadri Securities, joins us now. Great to have you.
Good morning.
Good
Thank you for
morning.
having me.
Good morning. So the CBN recently published the supervisory framework for payment service bank. What does this framework entail and what does it mean to an average Nigerian?
Yes, so I think the way to start is to take us back to 2012 when CBN launched National Financial Inclusion Strategy with a goal of achieving financial inclusion rates of 80%. And I think thus far, we've been able to record steady progress over the years. However, the overall progress still remains suboptimal. I think when you consider the fact that financial inclusion for the adult population is roughly about 51%. So one of the strategies that CBN has identified as a catalyst to accelerate financial inclusion in Nigeria has to do with the activities of payment service banks. So that supervisory framework published by the CBN, it provides guidelines on a broad range of issues that would, provide guidelines for operation of payment service banks in Nigeria. So in terms of the activities they're expected to be involved in and their activities they're also excluded from, CBN did well in providing clarifications on these activities. In addition, CBN also provided guidelines on corporate governance framework, their board composition, how they should also set up their data infrastructure and measures that should be put in place to also curtail the activities of cyber criminals. So it's, an elaborate document from CBN that we're optimistic about in terms of how that will drive activities of payment service banks in Nigeria.
So do you think this will impact players in the telecommunication sector, given that they have applied for the PSB license?
Yes, to the best of our knowledge, major players in the sector have all applied for license from the CBN to kickstart operation of payment service banks. So MTN, Airtel, and even Glo, we all understand that these companies have applied. However, CBN requires that they are to operate those business as a standalone. In other words, those businesses should be set up as a subsidiary rather than, MTN still carrying out those businesses. So it's a case of you have to set up a subsidiary that will carry out the payment service bank operations in the country. So in terms of the activities they are permitted to engage in, they are allowed to issue prepaid card services to their customers. In addition, they're also permitted to facilitate payments of transactions for their customers. However, in terms of activities they're excluded from, I would think CBN has been able to somewhat protect the banking industry. I think when you consider the fact that they're excluded from granting out loans and advances to their customers, in addition to facilitating sales of foreign currency.
All right, so the regulator has, through the framework, mandated operators to deploy at least 25% of their services to rural areas to be defined by the regulatory body from time to time and other unbanked areas. Do you think these PSBs can, strive in rural areas?
Yes, so for us, we think, that's a very positive development when you consider that a large proportion of those who are unbanked actually reside in these rural areas. So that strict condition put in place by CBN, ensuring that you must have 25% of your financial touch points in the rural areas is one that we think will, improve or contribute immensely towards improving financial inclusion. But the major barrier we see to the actualization of that target has to do with financial literacy. So we understand that, looking at the various geopolitical zones across the country, those in the northwest and northeast, that's where you have a high proportion of those who are financially illiterate. So we think, given the rising insecurity challenges in the country, that might potentially limit the ability of this payment service bank to deploy agents to those areas, even as they begin operations of the payment service bank. So that's the major barrier that we think might constrain the inclusion of those in the rural areas who we think, a bulk of them still reside in the northwestern and northeastern parts of the country.
So is there a way you think this process can be accelerated? You talked about financial literacy, especially in the rural area. Is there a way you think it can be accelerated?
Yes, so I mean, the way to look at it is to consider how government can also complement the efforts of the central bank. So in terms of that, we've seen cases of attacks and kidnapping in schools. And of course, if schools are unable to operate, it means that they're unable to, of course, provide services to students on a daily basis. So that is going to be a major drawback if you are looking at improving financial literacy in the rural areas. So we think the federal government has to step in at this point to complement the efforts of the central bank by improving security conditions in the northwestern parts of the country so that school activities can go on without any form of hindrance or setbacks due to security challenges. If we're able to get across that, we think as more people become sensitized and enlightened about the need for, getting connected to the banking industry, getting connected to payment service banks, will definitely be on track towards improving financial inclusion in Nigeria in the medium to long term.
All right, but do you think the activities of payment service banks, when they begin, full operations, will it pose a threat to earnings of banks?
Yeah, so what we think is, it's going to pose, they're going to stand a competition. They're definitely going to pose a threat to banks from the perspective of competition. And in that regard, we are looking at provision of electronic banking, electronic transactions to customers. So currently, a number of banks have been able to make significant investments in their technology just to improve customer experience when they're making use of their mobile apps or even internet banking for transactions. So the activities of payment banks also, it's more or less in line with what banks are already doing. So in that regard, we see potential for, reduced transactions from the part of the banks, particularly the fact that banks are also playing in the rural space, which is an area where we think payment service banks are also going to focus on. So we see more of, increased competition in that space, but we think the ultimate benefits will still be positive for the consumers, given that we are likely to see reduction in transaction fees going forward as competition in that space intensifies.
Okay, so with this, I remember we talked about the USSD and all those platforms. This is going to reduce cost, for the consumers. Though this is actually something that consumers should embrace.
Yes, so certainly I think if you look at the tussle between mobile network operators in Nigeria and banks with regards to the USSD service code, we've seen disagreements with regards to what should be the appropriate pricing for that service. So now what CBN has done is to enable these mobile network operators to now, carry out those services on their own without necessarily relying on these banks. So what we think is competition in that space will intensify, and we think it will then get to a point where these operators and banks will have to now reduce transaction charges just to attract customers to their platform. So it boils down to who is able to now offer, exceptional customer experience to their customers in addition to reduced transaction fees.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us on the program. It was great having you. Bolan Ologoro is the Senior Research Analyst at Codrus Securities. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Have a nice day.
All right.